Welcome to LSHTM Viral, a podcast exploring the science behind global and public health from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. I'm Naomi Stewart.
And I'm Karl Byrne.
Measles is on the rise again, here in the UK, across Europe, Central Asia, and in North America and the United States and Canada. Both those countries were considered to have eliminated the disease in 2000 and 1998 respectively, but have seen multiple outbreaks across the continent, with the disease spreading primarily through unvaccinated individuals amongst a rise in false claims and misleading information about the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine, known as MMR, and related falls in immunization. The United States has started seeing their first deaths from measles since 2015, and in Canada, the first measles-related death in 2025 occurred in a premature baby born with measles, contracted from their mother who was infected and had not received the MMR vaccine. There are similar trends here in the UK, with measles cases on the rise as uptake of the MMR vaccine for both doses fell to 84.5% last year, well below the 95% coverage required for herd immunity, and a child has sadly recently died in Liverpool after contracting the disease, amidst a local increase in hospital admissions for measles after vaccine coverage in the area fell to 74%. In London, there are now pockets even below 65%. According to the WHO, measles vaccinations have averted over 60 million deaths in the last 25 years. Even though a safe and cost-effective vaccine is available, in 2023 there were an estimated 107,500 measles deaths globally, mostly among unvaccinated or undervaccinated children under the age of 5. In this episode of LSHTM Viral, we'll unpack what makes this virus so dangerous, why old myths about vaccines still persist, and how public health is fighting a battle on two fronts, against both the disease and false claims about vaccines. First, we're speaking with Professor Liam Smeeth, Director of the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. So to start with, can you give us a quick refresher on measles? What is measles and how does it affect the body?
So measles is a viral infection. You inhale it and it makes you unwell. Gives you a red rash, very characteristic red rash. Gives you high fever, you feel terrible. About 1 in 100 or so get pneumonia. And then there's a sort of progression of more severe complications that can occur. But usually in most people, it's a fairly mild but unpleasant illness. But it's more risky in babies, pregnant women, people who are immunocompromised, and people who are with malnutrition as well.
So why do people think of it as just a childhood illness then?
I think because over decades in most Western and high-income settings, a lot of people had measles, and for the majority of people, it's an unpleasant rash and a few days of fever and you get better. But there's a substantial minority for whom there are bad complications and can be very severe complications, and indeed there's substantial mortality associated with it. But I guess the idea of it just being a childhood illness comes from the days before the vaccine, probably when most people in high-income settings would have had it as a child and would have got over it. But it, as I say, it did cause substantial morbidity as well in a minority.
So what are those serious risks or serious illnesses? What can actually happen with measles?
I mean, a small proportion, probably a few percent or more will end up getting admitted to hospital, usually because of respiratory problems, and about 1% or so will get pneumonia. But there are much worse complications, can affect the eyes, can affect the hearing, and several years after measles, there are severe problems such as brain development, and there's a condition called subacute sclerosing panencephalitis, which is a really severe neurological complication. It's fairly rare, but it's pretty devastating, and that might not appear for 5 or 7 years after the initial infection. All these complications are much more likely, and the disease itself is more severe in low-income settings where people have a lower immunity, but also if there's any malnutrition around, then it can be a much more severe disease.
The measles itself, it's quite known to be very infectious. Why is it so good at spreading compared to some other diseases?
It's so good at spreading partly because of the way it's spread in aerosol, and people with measles tend to cough. So they produce an aerosol, and the aerosol has loads of measles virus in it, not just a few, but really packed with measles virus. And it can hang around for a couple of hours. After someone's coughed, it can hang around in the air. So that's quite a big thing. The other thing about measles is it's infectious for 4 days after the rash occurs, but it's also infectious for 4 days before the rash occurs, even before people get ill. And for those 4 days, people might be coughing, might be sneezing, they might just be breathing near other people, and they can soon pass it on.
And it's not just that sort of immediate illness that's the problem. There's evidence to show that measles can actually affect the immune system. I was wondering if you could tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, there's a thing called immune amnesia, sort of memory loss. So your immune system works well because as and when it meets new viruses, bacteria, it learns to deal with them. So the first time you meet them can be quite bad, but your immune system soon learns how to deal with them. And the next time you meet them, it's much less severe, or indeed you're immune altogether. What measles can do is sort of wipe out that memory, not just of measles, but of everything else as well. So you're starting again. Now your immune system recovers, but it has to relearn all those infections.
So does that mean you've got to meet those infections again, or you've still got it?
And it also means that when you meet those infections again, you're going to get just as ill as you did the first time. So it's really bad news.
What's the actual mechanism that causes that?
The
to happen?
immune amnesia, it's quite a tricky one, but it hits both the B. So you've got B cells and T cells. It hits both of them, and it basically just sort of resets everything. It gets into both, and it basically forces the body to sort of stop. It makes a whole new strand of brand new ones. It forces the body to make a whole new strand of brand new ones that are literally brand new. So it basically accelerates this production. And so your body just makes these like brand new ones as if you've never met anything before. Quite bizarre.
And so how long can that affect someone for?
Oh, that can be for years. Yeah, as I say, the immune system recovers, but its effects can carry on for years as they meet infections that they were previously immune to. They've got to meet them again and get immune again and go through the same illnesses.
So along with this immune amnesia, you can also have cases of blindness, cases of deafness, and then also this subacute sclerosing
encephalitis. It can affect the brain in other ways and affect child development. It can affect motor skills and cause wider brain damage. It can cause permanent damage to the respiratory tract. So all of these things that are not in their own, I'm not going to claim they're common, but they do happen, and they happen to varying proportions of people depending on age and how well, whether someone's got good nutrition or not, whether they're pregnant. All sorts of factors play into this. But these are not rare complications. It's a nasty disease.
And whenever you sort of bring in the fact that it's so contagious as well, if it gets into an unvaccinated population, then you're going to see, even with the rare conditions, they're going to appear.
Yeah, absolutely. In an unvaccinated population, we know measles literally spreads. I think the expression kind of spreading like wildfire would actually be true, because in an unvaccinated population, every case is going to give rise to something like 15 other cases. And each of those 15 are going to give rise to another 15. And you can soon see that 15 times 15 is a big number.
So can you talk us through what the MMR vaccine is and how it works?
So the MMR vaccine, mumps, measles, rubella, it's all three viruses, and they're attenuated viruses, which means they are the virus, but they're treated so they can't cause the actual disease, but there's sufficient activity there to prompt your immune system to learn how to fight them. And through doing that, you become immune to them. It usually needs a booster dose, at least once. So the second time you get it, it just reminds the immune system and really gets it well trained. So it covers all three of the viruses.
But when you say treated, what does that actually mean? How would we treat a vaccine so that it's different?
So attenuated, well, you can either heat them or treat them with something that slightly just lessens the viral activity, either chemically, as I say, or heat treated. There's various ways of attenuating the activity, but you basically make it so that it isn't a sort of virulent disease-causing thing that can be passed to other people. Okay. It's just enough of the virus there to prompt person's immune system. So it's not quite dead. But
so is it slowing it down? Is there less?
Yeah, and it's not going to replicate in the person. It's not going to get passed on, and it's not going to cause the disease. But it is enough for your immune system to recognize the virus.
And the MMR vaccine, how long has it been around as a vaccine? How did it come to be?
It's been around really since it was introduced in the United States, actually very early in 1971. It wasn't introduced in the UK until the 80s, and then it's been introduced across much of the world through the 70s, 80s, 90s. In lower income settings, it tends to be measles, rubella, partly because the mumps isn't such a public health problem, but relatively speaking, but also because the mumps makes the vaccine much more expensive. So the measles, rubella on its own is part of the WHO schedule. But MMR is used in most high-income settings.
And before the MMR vaccine was introduced, I think there was about 2.6 million deaths per year. And after it was introduced, that dropped to about 4% of that level, I think about 100,000. Back in 1998, there's a now retracted paper which falsely claimed a link between the MMR vaccine and autism. And it sparked a media frenzy. Vaccine hesitancy went up. Cases began to rise. And very quickly, a lot of the world's biologists and virologists, epidemiologists started looking at this and quickly found that the paper was deeply flawed. Can you maybe tell us a little bit about how researchers went about testing the claims in that paper?
Yeah, so the main claim was that giving children MMR vaccine increased their risk of developing autism. And clearly that's big news to parents. And if it was true, it would be a serious issue. So there were various ways that was looked at. Some of the original biology it was based on was shown to be pretty spurious, really. There was a claim that there was measles virus within the bowels of children with autism, but it was never concluded whether those particles had come, in fact, from the vaccine itself, or indeed from having measles infection, or indeed whether that was any more common or less common among other kids. What we did was looked at a large population using general practice records in the UK, and we looked at a very large group of children with autism, and then what's called a control group of children without autism, and then went back and looked at their history of measles vaccine to see whether they'd had MMR or not, and basically found no difference at all. There were similar studies done in the USA and in Denmark, and came to the same conclusion. And the studies taken together really, I think, definitively show that there wasn't an increased risk. But unfortunately, by that time, as you say, vaccine confidence had been pretty dented and people were quite worried about this.
And so what do you think now, even after that study, and we've still had all this research that's proven that there was no link between the MMR vaccine and autism, why some people still continue to believe in that?
I think there's always a tendency to worry about vaccines, and that's understandable. It's quite a strange concept, injecting someone with an infection or parts of an infection. I think it's a complicated issue because vaccines will have side effects, and some of those will be serious. And it's a matter of being upfront about that and being honest about it, while also being able to communicate that the benefits of the vaccination are going to outweigh those risks, as in the risks of not having the vaccine and getting the infection are worse. I think there's been a problem in the past of people being a little bit, perhaps on the public health side and the clinical side, being too keen to say that vaccines don't have any problems, there isn't an issue with them, because we know they cause side effects, and some of those side effects can be severe. But the issue is not having it getting infected worse. And that is always the case these days with all the commonly used vaccines. So I do understand why people get concerned. I think the other issue, which is very difficult to communicate, is for a disease such as measles or polio, for example, where there isn't much of the infection around. If a single child misses their measles vaccine, I can't put my hand on my heart and say they're going to be at hugely increased risk of terrible measles and dying from it, one child at a time. But at the same time, if more and more children don't get vaccinated, we're going to see measles circulating, and then that's going to put whole populations at risk. So it's a collective good to be vaccinated when a disease is already quite well controlled. And I think, again, we have to be quite honest about that. And it's no point saying it's the absolute end of the world even for an individual child if they're not vaccinated. Yes, they'll be at increased risk of infection, but because virtually everyone around them has been vaccinated, the chance of them coming across the infection is relatively unlikely. But, as I say, that one-at-a-time approach doesn't really work for community health and public health, where you're trying to control an infection. And what really matters is very, very high levels of vaccination. So to give you the example of measles, because it's so infectious, to prevent it spreading in a population, 95% need to be vaccinated. So it doesn't take much to drop below that level. And once you drop below that level, if measles is introduced into that population, it will spread.
We're seeing outbreaks in countries like America, United States of America, I should say, and Canada, and then, countries like Romania as well. So, you've seen this up and down of measles cycles throughout the years. What's causing it right now in these communities and the outbreaks?
I think, as I say, as soon as you get a drop in vaccination, there's a risk of measles spreading. And then it's only a matter of time when you see a drop, and it might be a year, it might be 2 years after that drop, where there's substantial numbers of children running around susceptible to measles. It's just a matter of when does the measles arrive in that community. As and when it arrives, it will spread, and it will cause disease among those children. And particularly if there's young children around, and children around their first birthday, perhaps about to get vaccinated, they're at extremely high risk. If they get measles, they can get really ill. So it is a matter of the measles virus coming along and getting introduced into communities, but that's the mechanism.
And how sort of scalable is that if we were to, say, have a country that changed its vaccine policies or introduced skepticism and people were being a bit more hesitant? Could it spread outwards from that country?
We've seen that with polio, where the 2 or 3 countries that didn't achieve very high vaccine coverage were really reservoirs for the whole world of the polio virus, and did indeed continue the spread worldwide from those reservoirs. And certainly if a country decided to do away with measles vaccine, they would, over a number of years, start to see high levels of measles virus circulating, and they would become a reservoir for the whole world in the modern day of air travel. They'd be introducing measles all over the place. And that really would matter even to some countries with very high vaccine uptake, because there are still going to be unvaccinated people. And if there's a lot of measles about, even if you're the last person who was unvaccinated, you're going to be at risk.
So what can we do as a global health community?
It's a difficult one because it's a preventive treatment. It doesn't measles, vaccines don't make you feel better. They don't treat illness. They are preventive, and particularly thinking of global health, but health budgets worldwide are under pressure. And there's always a temptation to focus on treating the illness in front of you and alleviating suffering. And so it's quite quick for preventive things to fall off the agenda and think, well, that's not really affordable, but it's the absolute best investment in the future we know.
What kind of messages or approaches have worked in rebuilding confidence around vaccinations? Or is that something that we're still trying to find answers to?
I think that's, particularly in the era of social media, I think that's just an ongoing big area of research. I think it's clear that repetition and honesty and keeping things simple all help. I think getting in early and anticipating what might be circulating in social media can help. I remember in the COVID era, there was quite a surprising story suddenly spread on social media that the COVID vaccines made women infertile. And it spread within weeks of them being introduced. And it was a total out of the blue. No one knew where it came from. And it almost certainly came from a kid's cartoon where an evil dictator makes a vaccine that makes women infertile. And this spread everywhere, and everyone decided that was true of COVID too. So you never know where these things are going to come from. But I think we're really only just beginning to get on top of how to deal with the speed at which things spread in social media, and also the reinforcement people get from being fed things that they're likely to agree with.
And if there was one message you could get across to any policymakers who are listening, what would that be?
Keep going. It's not getting complacent. It's that some of these diseases have almost disappeared, particularly in high-income settings. But if you take something like polio, we really could have eradicated polio, as a risk from the world. We were so close, and we've just lost it because people took their eye off the ball and allowed some populations to have quite low vaccination rates, and they've got infected. Infections have spread again. And so it really is a matter of going and keeping going, even when it feels like, it's under control now. We know that isn't true. You'd have thought by the late 90s in the UK that measles was completely controlled, and yet there was a relatively small drop in vaccine uptake. And we saw outbreaks. We saw kids getting damaged, ill, in hospital with pneumonia, and we saw kids dying. So it's difficult not to be complacent when things look good, but things look good because we've got high vaccine uptake.
Have you got a message for any parents or caregivers out there who may still be worried about the vaccine or be hesitant about giving it to their child? Yeah,
the first thing to say is I think that's completely understandable. Children are little and defenseless, and jabbing them with a needle is bad enough. Jabbing them with bits of infection or even whole bits of infection, I can see why that might be scary. But We have huge track records of research for all the vaccines that are in common use. And as I say, I don't think, it's good to be honest and say that all the vaccines have some risks associated with them, but all those risks are lower than the risk from infection itself. And so it isn't a matter of it's 100% safe, and that would be a foolish thing to say. But the best bet for the health of the child is to be vaccinated.
Thank you, Liam. Next up, we're speaking to Heidi Larson, Professor of Anthropology and Risk and Decision Science and Director of the Vaccine Confidence Project. Heidi, from your work on vaccine confidence, how would you describe the state of global trust in vaccines right now in the UK and globally?
Well, it's not in great shape, to be honest. Compared to what it was before COVID, there has been a drop, and it's been quite global. Africa, we're monitoring it in the Vaccine Confidence Project regularly, and slowly their confidence is building back, but Europe, not so much. The UK also took a bit of a hit in terms of confidence during COVID. The one thing about confidence is it's a sentiment, so it can change. It's just needing more work than before.
And why do you think vaccines, more than other types of public health interventions, are such a focal point for misinformation and mistrust?
Well, it's a beautiful platform for anyone who wants to disrupt things. It's one of the only public health interventions that really tries to reach every individual in the world, and particularly during COVID and the global nature of it, it really lent itself to critique. I mean, I know water sanitation is often named as the other most impactful health intervention, but it is less targeted to individuals. So for misinformation, someone who wants to disrupt, it's a great platform, and it's also one which is highly polarized.
Yeah, and what makes it such an emotionally charged subject, especially when it comes to children and parents? Why do people feel so connected with it?
It's interesting. I'm leading a Lancet commission now on the emotional determinants of health. And one of our key case studies is vaccines. I think it's emotional for a number of reasons. One is, when you think of it, it's a little scary, particularly if you're a little child, to have a needle coming at you. When you're more adult and, you can rationalize what it's for, it's different. So there's just that aspect of it. Prevention in general is a harder sell in public health than a treatment or a cure, because if you're sick, you're much more willing to take risks to feel better. When it's a mother and it's her healthy baby, she's going to think twice about whatever she does. And historically, a lot of the reasons for why you get vaccinated were very evident. The diseases we're preventing were rampant, and kids die less of some of these diseases because public health in general is better.
So Heidi, we've talked in this episode to Liam Smeeth about the infamous, now retracted Wakefield paper from the late 1990s. I'm just wondering, in your view, how much damage did that moment do to public trust in the MMR vaccine or vaccines in general? And have we fully recovered from it?
It did tremendous damage. It's actually a really important story. Typically, a paper like that, I think it was 12 children and was soon debunked. That kind of paper might just have gotten forgotten. But a couple things happened. One, you had a lead author who was almost evangelical and remains almost evangelical about his deep belief on the connection with autism. He spoke out on the media event beyond what was in the paper, and his paper, without his knowing, happened to land on the year that Google opened its doors in 1998. So there was a platform way beyond 10 years earlier. I had come from the US to the UK. In the US, the big anxiety was thimerosal. It's a preservative in not all vaccines, some, but particularly to keep vaccines stable and safe for the multi-dose vials, which is particularly important in poorer countries, but any multi-dose vials. When I came to the UK, nobody was talking about the Measles. The whole issue was on the MMR vaccine. What they have in common is the public, and particularly parents, hungry for an answer to why more kids are getting autism. Wakefield came on the heels of an audience eager for something to explain why more kids are getting autism. He himself spoke out and championed what he was saying well beyond the Lancet paper. In his case, perfect storm to support a campaign bigger than I think he ever imagined. And then there were other people who joined his campaigns. Another important piece of that story is that when that paper came out, it wasn't that MMR uptake dropped the next week. It took 5 years for it to get to its lowest point after the article. So these things brew, and that's why in the Vaccine Confidence Project, we are focused on monitoring confidence so that you have an early indicator of when confidence starts to drop. You need to pay attention to it then before actual uptake drops. These days, they are much more reactive than 1998, but still, these things take time, and you have time to intervene.
So after that paper came out, there was a lot of research went into seeing if there was any possible links between MMR and autism, and they've overwhelmingly come back showing that there's no detectable links between them. So why do you think the myths about MMR causing autism still persist today?
We don't have a simple answer to why more kids are getting autism. And I think we could have double that amount of evidence that it's not MMR or thimerosal. But until they get an answer, and sadly, we don't have a very clear answer, we do know that it's not one single thing, likely. There's some evidence of some being genetically related, but not all. There's clear evidence that when the father is much older than the mother, that there seems to be a higher preponderance in those parenting dynamics. One thing that's happening for all the other challenges of the current head of HHS in the US, RFK Jr., when it comes to the autism question and the issue and suggestion, which has no evidence yet, that vaccines cause autism, he has thrown the net much wider and engaged scientists to look at all possible triggers, including toxins in the environment, which his background is actually as an environmental lawyer and has done a lot of work on toxins in the environment. And what's been good about that is it has taken the singular focus off vaccines. I don't think that was his intention, but I see that spreading the net wider and that hunt to find the cause really what parents want to hear.
I also think it's really interesting that the original, now retracted paper never outright stated that the MMR vaccine caused autism. It was that autistic children had gut problems which could have been caused by a persistent measles infection. And so even taken at its face value, if it had had more than 12 people, it didn't really put forward a case. A lot of that seemed to have come from the media afterwards.
And that's where I don't think the Lancet and Richard Horton were particularly thrilled when he added that in the press conference about making that link, which was not part of the paper. But I should say that that link was made much more explicit in a paper published in an Israeli journal that has gotten almost no traction. I hunted it down when I was writing my book Stuck, and I thought, wow, this is much more explicitly claiming that link. It's a paper that's in English and globally accessible, but it doesn't have the profile of the Lancet. And so I think it's really his personal campaign that has really been what's kept us alive.
I was just wondering, what do you feel are the main reasons that people today are hesitant or refuse to vaccinate? And are they different to what you were seeing 20 years ago?
Oh, absolutely. I think 20 years ago, people would still kind of defer to their GP or the official guidance. I mean, there were specific issues, vaccine safety scares in certain situations, some of them legitimate, some of them coincidental. In the 15 years of our Vaccine Competence Project, coincidentally, it's really been a period of rapid escalation of social media, new technologies, and we've had the opportunity to see over time that amplification of safety concerns, risks, and people coming together and talking about it. So I think the whole landscape has really changed. The dynamics of who people trust have changed. It varies by regions and cultures. Like you'll see a lot more people deferring to a religious leader if they're debating, but really people are not as willing as they used to be. And what's very concerning, and I don't know if you saw the piece in the Sunday Times, it was last month, about healthcare professionals not taking their vaccines. It was very high numbers in the UK who were not getting their flu vaccine and working in hospitals. And I think a newer trend is healthcare professionals themselves, not necessarily being outright refusers, but maybe being a bit hesitant and much less willing to be put in the position of trying to persuade parents. They'll give them the information, but we're hearing, don't put us in the hot seat trying to persuade someone. We don't want to get into a contentious argument. We'll give them the information. And in some countries, I've heard the doctors saying, if the patient brings it up, we'll address it. We don't want to introduce that topic. That's how contentious the topic has been in some settings.
And also, you mentioned Google around the time the Wakefield paper came out. How has social media and the internet really changed the landscape of vaccine misinformation and hesitancy?
I think the main thing is that it's spread it much faster. In terms of the difference between the misinformation, which is, maybe seem a bit plausible and people share it because they think it's real, which has grown a lot. This disinformation, which is purposefully propagated inaccurate information or alternative information. But the other thing is those circles of influence, in social media analysis, see swarms. It was mostly parents, or occasionally you get adolescents around HPV or pregnant moms groups talking about various vaccines recommended for pregnant moms. But the general population was not really engaged so much with that. What we saw in COVID, when everybody was pushed online to look for information on vaccines, it totally changed the landscape to the point the systems almost shut down with a lot of misinformation. And what was also happening was that groups that had no conversations about vaccines, like far-right groups, for instance, in Germany, or the kind of pro-nature green movements, they all teamed up. Online, you saw these different, somewhat previously disparate groups coming together under a shared rubric of against government control. And that's a hard one to turn around. I think it's also spread quickly because the public health community has been, one could say, shy, but even anxious about going into social media because it feels very toxic. So by not being there, though, it's kind of rolled out the red carpet. And I think that's somewhere we really need to shift gears. And I have great hope in the emerging generation of doctors who are a bit more digital savvy.
Yeah, no small feat to undertake, but that is a really interesting point. And, following on that, we're seeing measles outbreaks specifically in North America and the States and Canada and Europe, where vaccination rates were much higher previously. So what do you think the role of vaccine hesitancy and misinformation is? And, how much effect has COVID been driving that as well?
Well, I think COVID has driven a lot of it in terms of the fertile ground factor, because a lot more people who before were not even questioning vaccines, and many who had no idea they were even kind of debates about it now have questions in their mind. But we have a lot more vaccines, and I think people have a lot of other grudges that they're taking out on vaccines because it's, as I mentioned earlier, it's such a big platform. It also is so totally tied with government because it's governments that review, regulate, require, sometimes mandate vaccines. So anyone who has issues with government, we see again and again in all of our research that if you trust your government, you're much more likely to be open to vaccines. If you have questions or distrust, you're much less likely. I think that's another challenge, particularly in this current environment globally. We're in a pretty rocky time.
Yeah, that's good food for thought as well. How do we make the argument that vaccines are global in science and not government decisions? And thinking of that bigger picture, what are the broader public health consequences when vaccine coverage does fall in certain populations, as we've been seeing with measles?
Well, you have more deaths, and I think in certainly in poorer populations, they're much more prone to die from measles. In Europe and the U.S., the likelihood of a child dying of measles is less because their overall health is better. But if you're malnourished or if you're poor or any kind of immune related, you're not getting enough of other things, it's awful. It's an awful disease and can be quite fatal. And it's interesting. Europe had almost 130,000 cases of measles last year. I mean, that's WHO 53 countries, not the 27 EU countries, just to be clear, and that more of that was in Eastern Europe. In the US, there was a good bit of panic, about 1,000 cases across the whole US. But for the US, that was a lot. And we haven't had a death in I don't know how long. And now it does mean that you're going to get more cases, but there's also a big difference in the sense of we have school mandates to go to school. And that clearly means more kids get vaccinated, although there's more and more debates about that. And that's less of a thing in Europe. France and Italy have school mandates, and that increased in 2018, 2019, when we had 80,000 cases of measles in Europe.
Have you seen what kinds of public health messages or campaigns actually work in rebuilding or keeping vaccine confidence at a high level? Is it about facts, or is it more about values and trust? Like, what is it that people connect to?
Well, you just touched on probably the three biggest ones. It varies in different places. One of the things we really learned, and it's really changed in those 15 years, we have learned that facts are not going to change the minds of people who are pretty set in their ways. It could help for people who are hesitant, but we need to first understand why they're hesitant. It may not be about facts. So one of the first things we do is try to ask people why. But in terms of interventions, which to your question, we see again and again hyper-local, local trusted, local engagement. And I think coming out of COVID, the last thing you want to do is talk about campaigns. I think the top-down approach to immunization really has to take a back seat for a while. Even if you do population-wide, it should not be promoted as that. People have a real antibody to these top-down campaign approaches, particularly coming out of COVID, but already before. We saw a similar thing with the polio eradication initiative after so many years. And fatigue is too gentle of a term. I mean, it was really like enough already. We saw some really brilliant things of how non-traditional people would engage, like in the UK, and particularly in London, in the Bangladeshi community in East London, had some of the highest mortality, serious illness of COVID. It turned out to be the restaurant owners who were really rising to the occasion, doing selfies of getting themselves vaccinated. Who would have thought in PHE or NHS, let's engage the restaurant owners? Well, they had a particularly important role in that community. Large families, very tight-knit, but living in small apartments where you can't bring the extended family together. So they had a social function in these people's lives. And they were like, we need to get our community back. We need to get our businesses back, but we need to open our doors again so your families can come together. And in the US, in the Black community, there was a really effective effort. They called it Black Doctors Against COVID. And a lot of Black doctors went into communities, some of the Black communities, and really built trust and engaged and were there for people. And then they also involved the barbers and the hairdressers, which were where people hang out, and a regular trusted person in families' lives. And I think we can't lose those examples.
And if you were to say to policymakers or public health leaders about rebuilding trust in communities where vaccine uptake has fallen, would you be suggesting that they try and have these locally led ideas and programs?
Yes, and I would just really stress the importance of listening. Historically, the public health programs, and particularly immunization programs, had much more of a we know best and, pushing out the information, all important information, but it didn't respond to what the issues and needs are. And sometimes you need to listen to their issues and needs beyond the vaccine, because that sends a signal that you care about these people's lives. You're not just giving them a jab to check it off. And that, unfortunately, there's not that underlying trust that it's in my well-being. You're trying to get something out of it. So trying to see, how are you doing? It's been a rough ride after COVID, and just have a little bit of a listen, and it'll make a big difference.
And obviously, you've said that active listening and finding out exactly what people's concerns are is very important. But if you could give any advice to parents or caregivers who might be hesitant about vaccinations today, is there anything you would tell them?
It's really important that parents get their children vaccinated. I think we've missed the mark in how we've been, as a public health community, promoting vaccines. We have not promoted vaccines as a natural way to boost your system. It's a tiny, tiny little drop that goes into your system to kickstart an immune response that's yours. It's your immune system that's doing the work. And I think that you're doing it for your kid's own natural immune system, and to get that natural angle in on it, I think would help a lot of parents. I think some of them have the perception you're pulling up to a petrol station and pouring all these chemicals in, which is so far from the truth. But the media has scared them. And, when you're a first-time parent, I think we need a little more empathy. It's not easy to know the right thing to do, and it's really important. And talk to your doctor if you've got questions. People don't always find the information they need on a public website.
And one final question from me. If you could leave listeners with one key message about vaccination and public trust, what would it be?
Trust the value of vaccines to keep your children healthy and lives saved.
Thank you to both Professor Smeeth and Professor Larson for sharing their insights into measles and the deadly disease, and what we can do to tackle the tide of false claims about the MMR vaccine. Before you go, if this episode has piqued your interest and you want to learn more about tackling major public health challenges like measles, which has such a complex physiological response, or other infectious diseases and their impacts on individuals and populations, check out the MSc Immunology of Infectious Diseases here at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. This degree provides students with a deep understanding of how the immune system responds to major infectious diseases affecting global health. You'll explore how the body defends itself against infection and how we can use this information to create life-saving therapeutics and vaccines. The program combines theoretical knowledge with practical laboratory skills, preparing graduates for careers in biomedical research, public health, or further study. Applications for 2025 for those students requiring a visa to the UK close on July 27th, and for students not requiring a visa on August 31st. Visit the link in the show notes for more information or email study@lshtm.ac.uk. That's study@lshtm.ac.uk. Karl and I will be back soon with another bonus episode of LSHTM Viral. But in the meantime, if you'd like to get in touch with questions, comments, or ideas for a future episode, you can reach us at comms@lshtm.ac.uk. That's COMMS@lshtm.ac.uk.